Warhammer 40,000 is a dark, confusing, and often terrifying universe. It's a world where what we do know is vastly eclipsed by everything that we don't. Mankind has to a large extent abandoned any hope of regaining its former glorious knowledge, but things were not always as they are now. The 40k of many years ago is not the 40k that we know now. In fact, first edition leading into second edition was far more confusing than anything we have now. Entire races were rewritten multiple times in the space of only a few years. Some would be fleshed out and then remain stagnant for the next 30 years. This is Luton and welcome back for another 10 Things episode. Warhammer 40,000 has progressed through many editions since its original launch back in the late 1980s. Each progressive edition would bring sparse new details and usually omit far more that had been in previous editions. It seems that the makers of 40k believed in keeping the pleb masses in blissful ignorance just as much as the Imperium of Man. Likely for similar reasons as well, because the less your citizens know, the less questions they'll ask, and the less you have to explain. So across the decades, this has led to lots of debate and arguing. We will often see people referring to things in first edition as being an origin and therefore automatically definitive and canon, and that's not really the case. The thinking for this though does seem straightforward enough, and that's mainly because first edition simply contains far more descriptive language than most editions that would follow. And because of that, it's often assumed that because there is just simply more detail, that this must be the more canon material. Except that this is not good thinking, especially when you consider the style and abrupt rewrites of material with first edition that were very different to what would come later. In fact, between the initial release of first edition and its supplements up until just before the release of second edition, a vast amount of information changed, and not small corrections, entire retcons of races in 40k and others that were just abandoned. Not to mention how drastically the miniatures themselves changed. This extremely fast development in the early period for me personally underscores why second edition was really the true origin of 40k that would shape the game that we would know now. It's true that first edition was a seminal foundational experiment, but it would be instantly built upon and strategically thinned down to keep what worked best. So whilst first edition gave birth to 40k, it was second edition that defined it. I think the reason you often see people refer to things from first edition as being definitive is, like I say, the simple reason that it contains a lot of information that you don't see anywhere else. But I always think that as second edition came along, it should be a pretty big clue that they decided to sideline a lot of that detail almost instantly, and then later it would be easy to just omit, but not necessarily to retcon, because that always keeps the door open. Just because of the way in which first edition developed and how quickly it happened is a good reason why you should see it with more skepticism than any other edition that followed. And because of this, including much of what was written in the other books like Realms of Chaos, they're so old now that they should really be treated with a healthy amount of caution. Now, not disregarding them to be sure, but definitely viewed in the proper context. But with that said, there are of course plenty of details and narratives that were laid down in first edition that would carry through and become entrenched as the bedrock of 40k. But I've talked before about how I like to view and treat information from the lore across the various periods, and unless something has been restated multiple times in subsequent editions, you should definitely lean in on discarding it as unreliable, but at the same time not disregarding it completely. Which then nicely brings us to our topic for today, because as much as there is a lot of solid material that will be carried forward, there is a joyful amount of strange oddities and just plain weird things in first edition. Some of this stuff is very much related to the tabletop game, and some of it's just very comical. Other ideas are actually pretty awesome. For example, as well, the artwork for first edition is also beautifully of its time. 40k first edition resembles something much more like pen and ink Judge Dredd than it does the high-end digital concept art that we see today. This is obviously, like I say, reflective of the time and what other artists were inspired by around this period, but much of it really gives you pause to consider it and how it's representing the world of 40k. One thing I'm often especially interested in is how the Space Marines are illustrated with far more human and emotive expressions, whereas the Astartes of today all too often look like they're straight out of Starship Troopers. Anyway, this idea of the stylistic change in 40k is probably something I can recycle and expand upon later with some more specific thoughts. So let's look at some of the weirdness and strange things from first edition. Now, first edition was significantly more fleshed out when it came to Xenos, and we're talking about proper, non-specific Xenos, not just things which aren't human. Instead of the token gestures we've seen that might expand a little beyond the rules for a couple of extra things that are beyond the core, like maybe the amble for example, first edition 40k had rules for Xenos like warp creatures such as astral hounds, spectres, enslavers, also generic warp entities, Xenos like the Psychonunin, or however you pronounce this, vampires, zombies, carnivorous sand clams, the Katashan devil and face eaters, which are well known even now, but no real specific rules for these things, crawlers, crotalis, Cathalan cudbears, dinosaurs, the Ferrobeast, Genestealers, giant insects, giant spiders, groks, grinks, horses, lashworm, mimics, terror squirrels, razor wings, rippy fish, swarm and sunworm. But it doesn't end there. In first they also went on to list a variety of plants, all of which would have actual potential effects on the units on the battlefield, so things like the Katashan brain plant, gas fungus, spikers, spongeweed, tangle fungus, and of course the always entertaining Venus mantrap. The thing is, with a lot of older editions of 40k, including first, they actually took a pretty long time to play. First edition 40k was far more of a sort of game master RPG affair than it was a fast and actionable tabletop game. And this is one of the reasons why they've done many revisions over the years, which finally led to the large consolidation of material in 8th designed to speed things up. And while that was well intentioned, it also seems a shame to take out things like these Xenos details that can make a game all the more intriguing. And you could still invest in custom elements for yourself for sure, features that are almost akin to NPCs with the rules for enemy flora and fauna who would have a random turn all of their own. Of course, the best thing about 40k, even today in 8th edition, that many people never seem to remember, is that you can still do that. You can still invent anything and any rule or any unit or weird oddity that you fancy, so long as your opposing player is happy to include it in your game. Just because there are tournament high-end rules that exist, you don't have to play like that. You can play openly, you can have fun with your friends, you could still have giant sand clams crunching down on unsuspecting Imperial fists that walk by. So unless you were playing at a serious tournament or some kind of competitive situation, I think it would be great for people to throw in a few sand clams, giant spiders onto a battlefield, because everything that you could find in first edition could still be used with just a few tweaks and updating. And it makes me think that maybe I could do this. I could make some 100% unofficial, use or throw them in the bin, data cards. It's a thought. If you guys want me to do that, tell me down below if you think you'd genuinely use them in your games. So a stranger detail in the first edition of 40k, well known by anyone who's looked back to the details of this time, Tyranids were a thing in the first edition, but crucially Genestealers were not Tyranids, which is very odd indeed. And this is the moment for you to remember what I said in the intro about how people will reference things from first edition that are usually loosely accepted at best to, say, proper discussion, yet will happily ignore other things like this, that have been just fully retconned for obvious reasons. Genestealers are one of those things, and it illustrates how lore can be from time to time just crossed out and started from scratch. Still though, this was a new and experimental verse, and so changes like this are far less devastating. You couldn't imagine them doing something as drastic as rewriting an entire species or faction in the lore like this now. That would be crazy, wouldn't it? Moving on. Genestealers are described as originating from the moon of Emgal, however the hell you're supposed to pronounce it. Since then, they have spread throughout space and become a menace. Unlike the later Genestealers, which are far more Tyranid-esque, Genestealers in first edition, or early first edition I should say, are sort of a cross between the bottom half of a raptor and some sort of lizard man with the face of a giant leech, and they reproduce much like a xenomorph, implanting an egg capsule into any host, which will then seemingly absorb some of their genetic material as they eventually burst out, killing the host. And if they were to continue reproducing within the same pool of genetic material, they would become more and more like their host. And so here in first edition is laid down the initial concept of the Genestealer hybrid, which later develops into Genestealer cults. It also describes that on their homeworld they use a leech-like creature known as a Sith, with a C, to produce a natural Genestealer-like form. It doesn't absorb any genetic information, so it keeps their form as a creature more pure, essentially, like a pure strain Genestealer. Lastly, as is often the case with 1st edition, some of the rules are more narrative based and interesting than the modern versions of 40k. So, Genestealers in 1st, when landing a hit in close combat, would implant an egg into their opponent. On subsequent turns, a dice roll is made, and any rolls of a 6, the egg will hatch, killing that unit, and the newborn Genestealer will then have a chance to fight and maybe reproduce again once it has killed 3 human-sized creatures, except that they take a full turn to eat their victim as well. Like I said earlier on, the early iterations of 40k took a lot longer to play. Genestealers in the lore would rapidly evolve, pun intended, and by late 1st edition, their weird moon origin story had already been scrubbed. This was setting them on the path to be fully integrated as Tyranids, and neither seemed to really be taking precedence. In fact, most of the lore for each remained largely the same. They were more amalgamated into one species, just taking the best lore elements from each. More strangely, Genestealer cults were seen as being able to somehow align themselves with chaos. It's described that because they had stronger constitutions than ordinary humans, they could use chaos as a power source, but without so much risk that's normally associated with doing so and using chaos. It all gets pretty strange, and if you can believe it, they even had Genestealer cult limousines. The Tyranid Genestealer relationship would be revised in the later part of 1st edition, and I think officially this happened within the rulebook of the precursor to Space Hulk known as Space Crusade. This originally pitted Tyranid warriors against Space Marines, but it would be updated with an advanced Space Crusade rulebook, which I believe was the first official retcon of the Genestealer Tyranid relationship. Interestingly, a year later, they published the compilation book, which brought many of the updates that had been posted within White Dwarf, and the Genestealer cult's rules appeared here, except that there was no mention of Tyranids because these articles had probably been written before the updated retcon in the Space Crusade supplement. Anyway, things were clearly changing very fast in these years, as we know, so there's kind of some crossover. It can get a bit confusing. Now, the Advanced Space Crusade rulebook is actually pretty interesting in and of itself. It's not very big, but it lays out a lot of details that, again, as with many things from 1st edition, have barely been altered at all in the past 30 years. Things like, for example, the Tyranid's shadow in the warp effect. This is the first time that was ever mentioned, and it's in this kind of random supplement that goes alongside all the other 40k stuff. So it's kind of cool when you go back and see this, and like I say, it's still in the lore now, it's not altered in all that time. My favourite thing I discovered in relation to this Genestealer Tyranid origin stuff though was actually a description from a White Dwarf, which describes, and this is a quote, "The Advanced Space Crusade rulebook includes all the background information that you would expect. As far as Tyranids are concerned, there are details of the horrific nature of this alien race, covering its strange collective hive intelligence and its sub-races, its living bioengineered weaponry. We also reveal the real purpose of the earlier Genestealer invasions. These creatures were, of course, created by the Tyranids." Ah, of course, that's what they were all along. All that strange stuff about leech raptor heads, I must have just imagined it. See, they knew what the deal was right from the beginning. 100% for sure. I like this just because of the way it's worded. It's kind of like, it's obvious that they just rewrote it because they wanted to go in a different direction, but I like how they kind of like phrased it to make it sound like, oh yeah, we were just kind of throwing you out there with this original stuff, but yeah, we knew what was going on all the time. Of course, as part of this update in 1st edition, the biggest change for Genestealers was their appearance. Genestealers would now look much more Tyranid-like instead of being these strange raptor leeches, which I don't think there really was ever a model for. But they still keep a lot of their lore elements as well, like their drive to conquer humanity by infiltration. Their updated form in late 1st edition had a carapace, muscles of purple and red, bulbous heads. They still contain their sort of Genestealer abilities to inject their host, except now it's less of a xenomorph egg thing, and it's more like a cancer that's injected into the host that will slowly then transform them, altering their genetic material. This creates hybrids and will create then more hybrid forms that appear more and more similar to humans, much like the original description. Now, those of you familiar with the narrative known as the War in Heaven will also be all too aware of the Old Ones, also sometimes referred to as the Slan. Now, an important thing to note, as with everything in the 1st edition, the entire timeline of 40k had not been really properly established just yet. So for example, the Catan did not really even exist at this time, neither did the Necron, nor the War in Heaven. So much like the Genestealers, the first and only reference is fleeting and would sort of be retconned, but not in a very obvious or especially clear fashion. The Slan are talked about as being a very old race who encouraged evolutionary processes. They seeded planets and experimented with the galaxy as their playground. and after a time, though for unspecified reasons, they retired from an active role in the galaxy and moved into a period that was far more introspective. The reasons for this are deliberately vague, stating that the Slann could have discovered something in the galaxy that made them retire, or some truth or insight that is unseen by the other races. It describes them as being amphibian in their physical appearance, varying in colour from green to blue and yellow Slann. It's explained that while the technologically advanced Slann retired out of view, other more aggressive primitive populations are settled on worlds sitting around the fringes of the Imperium's empire, but that these Slann seem to want for very little, they seem to have no especial need to trade, and it's even suspected that they're being watched or even studied. The entry for the Slann from here on references this primitive culture and talks little about their past with no real lore to expand upon. And this is where the difficulty with the old ones, or who or what they were, arises from. As I mentioned a few times throughout this video, a lot of material from the first edition still stands today, and is often surprisingly close in how modern material is referenced, because the Slann's only other mentions appear, I believe, in the Realms of Chaos book and in relation to the Eldar in the first Codex Titanicus of all places. And then after that, it's never really mentioned again past the very first edition of 40k. Apart from in the 4th edition rulebook, they very strangely, baitingly threw an image in around the topic of Xenos of a Slann, and then just saw fit to leave it at that. There's no real mention of it, there's no description of it. It's really odd that it gets thrown in there, and as I say, it's 4th edition, not 2nd or 3rd, and then not after this. It's very weird how that image gets thrown in there. I mean, I genuinely wonder whether they sort of just put it in as like, whatever. The Old Ones and the Slann are a tricky subject because it all happened so long ago, at the very beginning of the galaxy, relatively speaking. So it's fairly easy to just go with the explanation of, we can't truly know, so just go with your own instincts. And while the Slann specifically would not be mentioned again, the Old Ones would be discussed later in obviously the Necron Codex primarily, so as to best frame the new narrative of the War in Heaven. The key thing for me though in the subsequent editions is that they're always referred to as the Old Ones and not the Slann, as well as being described as beings of shadow and light. It's even written that Slaanesh carved up the last remaining Old One, and it was these elements of shadow and light that would form the strange and passive objects known as the Umbra. The Slann were not now seen as being the Old Ones in the lore. They're more these kind of strange figures without real description of shadow and light, and they're sort of more ethereal. But in regard to the lore, the Old Ones, the Slann, it's one of these tricky elements. A lot of what's written is not very clear, so as to enable you to say definitively that it was retconned or it was abandoned. In fact, far from it, because we see material like Aeneid rising to become major lore material from just vague references that were made just one time in the decades previously. So it's definitely a thing that you can find these old lore elements and they can be brought back again. However, when it comes to the Old Ones and the Slann, some of it was very clearly reworked, like how it describes in the first editions that the Eldar and Old Ones encountered one another. It wasn't that the Old Ones created the Eldar, as is kind of stated in later editions, but that they just kind of met. And they did teach them their ways, they taught them how to use the webwave, for example, and that's true again of the later editions, so it's kind of all mixed together. And you could easily rationalize it and say, well, maybe this is just to do with Eldar mythology, that they were created by the Old Ones, or that they encountered them, whatever. And this is the trouble with this piece in the grand puzzle, because it's very sparse, it's very vague, and it also happened a very long time ago. Still, all the stuff to do with the Old Ones and the Slann has the potential to be mentioned and updated more in current times, because Games Workshop are working on the narrative around the Eldar, the Inari, the cyclical nature of their spirits and culture, and there's a reasonable chance that things could be mentioned in relation to the Old Ones and the War in Heaven. It wouldn't take very much to just tip the balance and be able to say definitively with some current reference which is a more plausible narrative. So we can watch this with anticipation. Hopefully some Eldar seer in an upcoming book or narrative reference in a rulebook will have some kind of vision that's going to point us in the right direction. Now, speaking of narrative, another stranger oddity in the original first edition of 40k was its Game Master role. The game itself was still essentially 40k, albeit with a considerable amount more detail applied to almost every element of the game. And 40k is usually a two-player affair, fighting with your forces to battle to the death or win some objectives, but in first there was a third role, the Game Master. Now, I've seen 40k players, competitive players, recently complaining, and complaining rightly so, that at tournament events sometimes rules are not quickly applied enough or problematic players not appropriately reprimanded. Now, in first edition, you actually had a referee role The Game Master would enforce rules, make calls on decisions, for example if a unit was not properly in cover or not, what might happen as a result of a certain action and so on. If you've moved a unit already, can you change your mind and go back, is it appropriate? So a Game Master role though could slow things down, but depending on who's playing, it could also speed things up. Still, it's become pretty standard and most people these days are easily capable of solving any rule-based issues themselves through mutual respect, which is why this role was probably thrown out, along with the fact that having to find a third person might not always be the easiest thing to locate every time you want to play. Although D&D is a big thing these days, so, and to be clear, the rulebook did suggest that it's possible to play without a GM as well. But with that said, a Game Master role for 40k could work out really well, and you could still do it like I said even today. For example, what if you decided to craft your own custom game between say 3 players instead of 2, with the Game Master taking on a specific role of say an independent unit or various objectives. You could corral some highly dangerous beast for example, or weather a storm, and your forces have to deal with various harsh environmental factors that are controlled and decided upon by the GM. And within the first edition of Rogue Trader there's an expanded section which has all manner of scenario elements to build a narrative with, from the strange Xenos flora and fauna that we described earlier, along with rules for hidden movement of units, environmental factors, compulsory moving, full RPG campaigns, and pages of plot generators for you to build a mission around. This is an interesting relic from this time when 40k was not really clear on what it wanted to be yet. And evidently only a few years later, most of this would be scrapped. But if you're playing the game just between friends, there's interesting pieces here that could be cherry-picked to spice up some normal open games of 40k, and a great way to involve more than 2 people in just a casual fun day of gaming. Now Dreadnoughts, like much of the early 40k, were considerably more complicated than they are now. But most interestingly and strangely, Dreadnoughts were seen as being more like a suit of additional armour to be piloted, not dissimilarly to say Centurions or Invicta tactical suits that we now see being used by regular and Primaris Astartes. However, there is also the description of Dreadnoughts requiring the pilot to merge their awareness with the suit's controls, to the point that they're indistinguishable and indeed inseparable, and this makes you think something more like an Imperial Knight or even a Titan, and how the Princeps, the pilots, must merge with the machine spirit to be able to properly operate these massive war machines. So the Dreadnoughts of 1st edition seem suggestive that at least their concept was that of proto-piloted Imperial war machines. It strangely states as well that if some pilots of Dreadnoughts were encased for extended periods of time, they could go insane and become renegades, abandoning their Astartes brothers and heading off to become mad mercenaries. Another thing they describe in more detail than modern editions is how they power and drive these machines, which as I say is pretty rare these days. Dreadnoughts, Xenos or Imperial are described as containing a variety of power sources, either a crystal battery, a nuclear engine, a polarizing gravitic bed, or just a generic combustion engine. And it goes on to say that crystal batteries are commonly used by humans and the Eldar. The descriptions in the 1st edition do talk about people piloting Dreadnoughts, but it also goes on to describe how due to the unreliability of the control systems, they might instead choose to deliberately surgically embed a Marine into a Dreadnought, even if they didn't really have to inter them as they do now from mortal wounding. The pilot is surgically implanted into the Dreadnought capsule and suspended in amniotic fluid, which will sustain him for the rest of his life. And you do see this kind of more grimdark situation where it could be that someone is designated as being a Dreadnought pilot, and instead of already being badly wounded, basically being put into the Dreadnought to save your life and extend your life, they could just come along and say, hey, you're designated to go into a Dreadnought, so bad luck, we're going to cut off your arms and legs and you're going to be put into this thing. The Dreadnought pilot then of course never be removed, and this obviously sets up for the later amendment to the law, which will become a process by which the mortally wounded Marines replaced in a Dreadnought to continue fighting on. However, it's an interesting fine line of difference in the 1st edition, and actually it's pretty 40k and grim dark to imagine going down the line and picking out the short straw, bad luck my friend, you're losing your limbs and you're going in the Dreadnought. A lot of the rules for Dreadnoughts as well contained more specific unit details than modern editions. For example, you could choose build points that would determine how you spec your Dreadnought in terms of the actual data profile for it. You could essentially build the actual stats of the Dreadnought however you wanted within some defined limits. You could also, for example, choose how the pilot was even linked to the Dreadnought machine. You could choose a mind impulse unit, which was the most effective, a spinal link, or just a standard pilot. Each would cost more or less points for your army and give a stat benefit for the Dreadnought on the battlefield to represent their finer level of control for the unit. You could spend more or less on the Dreadnought's power plant, and then cross-referencing this on a table of points. The more points you'd spend in the power plant, the more movement the Dreadnought could have. This is a very detailed system that then continued on to vehicle damage tables, which we won't trawl through. But again, it just shows how there's a lot more thought and detail in the first edition, and that's all very well and good on one hand, and it makes things very interesting, but on the other hand, it definitely slows things down just in terms of even speccing and getting your units ready to play with. But perhaps most enjoyable though are the Dreadnought's special attacks. These are close combat focused, and you have, for example, a tread attack, basically similar to an Imperial Knight's Thunderstomp stratagem. They could also apparently attempt to trip an enemy taller than 10 feet, which is just a hilarious thing to imagine. A Dreadnought in the midst of a horrific battle, he sticks his footpad out to try and trip up an enemy. It's just hilarious. They could also apparently do a bear hug close combat attack, so you can again just imagine them picking up an enemy, trying to crush them to death and, break their spine. Lastly, and best of all, Dreadnoughts could actually headbutt their enemies, and this is described in the official rules as follows. Roll to hit as normal. If successful, the Dreadnought nuts his opponent. It gets better as well. You roll to damage, and any enemy taking damage from a Dreadnought's headbutt is, quote, killed outright with no saving throw. I feel we could learn something from first edition rules. So as we've seen, a genuinely strange aspect of early 40k is that first edition would be one of the most rapidly developing editions. And I do think people often get the impression that first edition was the Rogue Trader book, and that was it, which is not at all the case. It was followed up by a variety of articles in White Dwarf that regularly amended and built upon the core rulebook, and then other games like Space Crusade. After this time, every edition that followed, despite introductions of say a couple of new races, the Tau, Necron, etc., supplemental releases in a comparative scale, altered very little. In fact, arguably, the only time we've seen development as fast as it happened in first edition is right now, in the 8th edition. So when people talk about first edition and Rogue Trader, it may be important to clarify exactly which year of first edition they're talking about, because that much was changing. The initial release of Warhammer 40,000 came in 1987, and it would be fleshed out over the years with the initial sort of codex releases. Things like Chapter Approved in 1988, which was a companion book giving a host of army lists. Then of course we had the ever-mentioned Realms of Chaos, which were a blend of Warhammer Fantasy and 40k, so you had to jump between the two things. Much like the Liber Chaotica years later in 2005, they would put out a compendium of information in 1989 and Advanced Space Crusade in 1990. In 1991, Games Workshop released a book called Warhammer 40,000 Compilation, which contained expanded elements for Imperial Marines, but also contained huge updates for the Eldar, who were now no longer strange space pirates, but instead a fully fleshed race with specialist units and even some background lore. But interestingly, the Eldar lore has probably remained some of the most consistent, and the vast majority of this original lore for the Eldar stands as it is. But even beyond that, not only the colours, but in fact the models themselves are the same. It's crazy, but the Dire Avengers and the Howling Banshees of the Eldar that I have in my own army, those are late first edition models, and those have really only now just been updated by Games Workshop, which is just mental. In this later period of first edition, they would also showcase the first colour schemes and unit designs for the new Eldar, again most of which astonishingly still are exactly the same today, and that's 30 years later, which is pretty bonkers. And there's a lot of models for other races like the Orcs, the Imperial Guard, etc., which are all waiting to be updated, because Games Workshop have been updating Space Marines so much, and many of the other races have barely been touched in decades. So yes, the Illuminati were, and with a large pinch of salt still potentially could be, a thing, so long as you go along with the it's not to be taken too strictly, use some caution side of things. According to the first edition, the Illuminati are one of the cults surrounding the Emperor, sort of. They make up a secret group who share a common experience of having at one time been possessed by demons and somehow survived. Most victims of demon possession would die horribly, either by being physically or mentally ruined in the process. Occasionally though, they avoid this, and either through sheer willpower, force the demon from themselves or escape it in some other way. And because of this, the Illuminati know of chaos. They are aware that its allure is not the whole truth. They have seen the darker side and understand the grave threat and horror that chaos represents. They're often seen as mad or mentally scarred by others, but they see themselves as realists whose eyes are finally opened. And that's all well and good. But here's where the lore gets a little bit bonkers. It describes that because the Illuminati have proven themselves able to survive the ravages of chaos, that they've shown that they are masters of the chaos within themselves, and that as a result they have been allowed access to the Black Library of the Eldar, which by modern perceptions of the relationship between Eldar and human seems pretty implausible. Although it is said that from time to time the Eldar have allowed access to some Grey Knights, for example, understanding that my enemy's enemy, so on. The Illuminati entry though goes on to describe how they stand above and beyond the Emperor. They manipulate and interpret Imperial will to meet their objectives, and they see things very plainly in an end justifying the means fashion. And even if that were to mean the destruction of the Emperor and the Imperium. This though is not to be misunderstood that they see themselves as more powerful than the Emperor, nor that they wish to see the annihilation of the Imperium, but it's in relation to another part of the Illuminati, where it is also said that they scheme to enable the rebirth of the Emperor, or what is called the Star Child. Now I'm not going to get into this too heavily today because I could do an entire other video about this, but essentially the Illuminati are one of the most secret organizations, known to very, very few, unknown even to the Emperor. They plan and they twist the strands of mankind's fate in the shadows to create a situation that will lead to an ultimate and final battle between humanity and chaos that will see the Emperor be reborn and lead humanity into a new age. The Illuminati, through their insight, know all about the fall of the Eldar and now seek to prevent this happening to humanity, which to be fair is not going well so far. They know that if humanity would fall to chaos, the result would be far more severe than the Eldar because of the sheer numbers of humans involved, and it could lead to a complete merging of the warp with reality, creating a bizarre realm where few mortal creatures would have any hope of ever surviving in some kind of ordinary existence ever again. And it is the Illuminati's goal to avoid such an event at all costs. Now there's a little bit more vague expanded detail to it, but this is basically the core of things. But as I say, to be clear, this is not something that has been widely mentioned since this time. But as with most 40k lore, it's also not really been strictly retconned. So who knows as to what role this bizarre society of tinfoil hat wearers could play in the eventual events of the Emperor and humanity. So a curious and interesting part of the early 40k, and this again applied to the period when I was first myself getting into 40k as a kid. Games Workshop actually gave a decent amount of suggestion on how you could make things for yourself for free. Now, while these days there are plenty of resources out there, YouTube, etc., for people to find for themselves on, say, how to make terrain, but there is far less coming from Games Workshop itself. They are doing more to do with painting and so on, but it's even more bizarre in the first edition. For example, they actually wrote about how you could use other brands of model to convert into vehicles for your games. It's just so off the wall, you cannot imagine them going close to this today. Now again, I used to do this as myself as a kid. I'd take random things, turn them into game units or terrain elements. But I was pretty surprised when I was doing a stream the other day and someone was baffled as to why I was basing my miniatures with some sharp sand in a box, and so I had to explain why I was doing that. And it really struck me as a thing that people didn't realise that they could use things other than Games Workshop texture paint to base their miniatures, that you can achieve the same thing with just some sand, PVA glue and some paint. And this to me highlights a pretty interesting thing, which is that many people seem to be quite unaware that they can improvise a lot of things themselves as a way to save money. Now, I recently discovered, for example, when I was going back through my old copies of White Dwarf, that in White Dwarf 184, for example, there is a full template for a cardboard bunker stronghold that you can make for yourself. And I did, and here it is. Now, I'll probably make a video for this soon, showing you how to make it, include the template for yourself, but it's curious though how back in the 90s Games Workshop was featuring regular tutorials on how to make terrain, how to improvise things for your minis and so on, and there seems to be much less of that these days, and I think it's a shame. It builds people's own creativity. I mean, I even went back and I looked through some of my old books and I found that in the 3rd and 4th edition rulebook this also contained some pretty solid pointers on terrain making. They even included similar templates to make your own buildings. But I also love in the 1st edition, and I remember I think also in the 2nd edition, it describes about how you can make a battlefield. And in these early editions, it basically says, put a blanket on your table, go into the garden, pick up some rocks and twigs, and that's it, you're good to go. So as I've done already with one video, I'll try and do some more where I show about terrain pieces, basing, other little details like this, other creative things and hobby stuff, because, you know, it's fun to do, it can be very relaxing, even if you're just kind of getting into it. Maybe I'll make some more cardboard templates for you to download, try out as buildings, etc. It gives me a lot of ideas for things that I could be doing. Just looking back at this stuff now has kind of inspired me, and it makes me want to do all sorts of different ideas. So then we have the ancient lost lore of the squats. I'll probably make this an updated, expanded thing at some point, but for now in first edition, the squats were very much part of the established order of 40k. What are and were the squats though? Well, they were basically the dwarves from fantasy lore. Remembering that 40k was originally a sci-fi version of fantasy Warhammer with its classic races of humans, orcs, elves, dwarves and so on. So when 40k came along, it only made sense to replicate this, right? Because 40k also has humans, orcs and space elves, so it should also have the squats. And they actually remained part of 40k into second edition as well. So it's not as if they were written out early on as part of first edition's radical and sweeping changes from its inception to the start of second. But once third edition came along, the squats were unceremoniously blanked, barely to ever be mentioned again. It should be said, importantly, that squats were not retconned. There still remains the prospect of their return to 40k, and notably because even now you can actually pick up a squat model from Games Workshop in the form of the bounty hunter Grendel Grendelson from Forgewell's Necromunda range, so squats are still very much part of 40k, but at the same time they would receive little love in the first Rogue Trader. But 2 years later in the Compendium book, they had a fairly solid background and army list, described as being an abhuman strain that are closest to humans in biological terms and allowed great freedom by the Imperium, not a phrase you hear very often these days. The squats supplied fighters and crews for the Imperial Guard, and according to first edition, much like Forge Worlds, the squat worlds are not directly controlled by the Imperial Administratum, which is pretty curious. They are instead granted a level of autonomy. And they have a strong sense of cultural unity and independence, but even more strange and wildly heretical, they do not follow the imperial cult of the Emperor. They instead venerate their own dead and their own ancestors. But by the second edition this had been revised, but not exactly retconned. The original dense lore of the squats from the Compendium was now considerably curtailed, stating with just one reference where it says that today the homeworlds of the squats and the Imperium trade for their mutual benefit and for the most part enjoy peaceful relations. There is more generally written, but in terms of the relationship between the Imperium and the squats, that's the only reference. The most interesting thing with regard to the squats though is that because nothing else has really been mentioned in relation to them since first edition and second edition, and as I highlighted the fact that you can still purchase squat miniatures officially from Games Workshop with rules and everything, what this means is the majority of the lore written for first edition squats still stands. And you can always have this debate and discussion about if a piece of lore is written and then it is not updated or anything really mentioned of it after a certain amount of time, that it basically becomes irrelevant and kind of backdated. But I think personally, as has been proven with the whole Eldar situation in 8th edition with Aeneid and the Inari, is that this argument about lore being outdated doesn't really apply. Anything from this time can be updated should they choose to do so, and until then it just kind of stands as is. That's my view anyway. Now lastly, first edition tried to bring together a concept that I think eventually set up the premise for a few things that would follow later. It's not really an established section in the original Rogue Trader book, but through a series of pages surrounding advanced gameplay, they describe in very brief detail about the Lost Worlds. These are worlds which are lost within the tide of the warp, the Eye of Terror really, and that some planets are isolated not for tens or hundreds of years because of this, but often for millennia. It describes them as planets of disorder and anarchy, and that the Imperium largely doesn't bother to attempt being involved with such places because they'll likely be lost again in the warp soon. However, they may attempt to briefly descend upon a world where possible to reap its resources briefly. Generally though, out here, Imperial order has no meaning, and no structure for those left on such planets to follow. But more than that, it goes on to explain that the warp storms that are wrapped around such worlds and for some reason keep at bay psychically dangerous warp entities, and as such, they're entirely cut off and shielded from this. But just because of this, it doesn't mean that these worlds are pleasant to live on. They're basically apocalyptic barren wastes, often with ravaging bands of orcs hell-bent on endless fighting, but also sometimes trading. Mercenaries will ply their trades to fight over resources, and this concept conjures up a strange kind of world not dissimilar to Necromunda and its underhives, where a society of scavenging human gangs fight for what little remains of their world. An obvious comparison could be made to something like Mad Max or indeed any apocalyptic survival narrative. These worlds, for all intents and purposes, never left the Age of Strife. For them, it continues on endlessly, and their worlds have become in some ways blessed by freedom from the Imperium to engage in personal lives of their choosing, involving themselves in everything that makes humans what they were in the old times, without fear of the Inquisition or the Imperium mixing them up in some mad galactic scheme or punishing them severely for not following the societal orders of the Imperium. All they have to worry about are a bunch of bloodthirsty crazy orcs crushing their towns and settlements. But I think what's most appealing about this is the simplicity of its setting. These worlds don't appear to suffer from the world-ending weaponry of the Imperium, but instead fight continual ongoing battles on a much smaller scale. Gangs of savage humans battling it out with whatever they have remaining. A strange mixture of perhaps outdated, barely functioning advanced weapons and old projectile firearms. Maybe some of these worlds seek ancient hidden mysteries in its ruined hive cities, almost kind of archaeologically, or even, who knows, hidden ancient AI or STCs long forgotten, unable to be explored by the Mechanicus and the Astartes. Maybe there's an AI on some of these worlds that are actually running the show. It's the human nature of the artwork that makes it so much more appealing. The buildings aren't daubed with Imperial Aquila, the people are dressed in creative, outlandish outfits, almost kind of superhero-ish some of the time. Some of the people seem to want to take on the role of law enforcement. Others run various disreputable and reputable establishments. Its inhabitants could exist along some of the most important technological mysteries awaiting humanity, and they themselves have no idea of just what's staring them right in the face, as it's long since been forgotten how to use such things. Ancient powerful archaeotech just awaiting discovery from a chance scouting mission on the rare opportunity that Imperial forces are able to travel to the planet before it vanishes back into the tides of the warp. What I liked about the Lost Worlds, and what I guess is comparatively strange to sort of modern 40k, is how this is very disconnected from the general narrative. It's very much about this sort of apocalyptic, more human civilization. It's smaller scale, it doesn't have some big grand scheme going on. It's just people living in these cities, living in these places, fighting it out. I think it would be a very good basis for a narrative, and again, you could almost scheme this within the rules of Necromunda and just expand it to this place. So, again, looking back to these first edition things really stokes your imagination, gives lots of potential for you to build and do things for yourself. 40k first edition is certainly an eclectic mix of artwork that is very much of its time, an often clearly experimental mix of ideas from a wide range of creatives. It has an unpolished feeling, still trying to figure out exactly what it is and what it wants to be. Within a few years though, it would be refined to form the second edition of 40k. Looking back at this old material though reminds me just how much of an organic process the development of 40k was, and I feel it probably is not too different than that today. Within the community, people have always speculated about how 40k could end. Could it be re-released in some new form, very similar to Age of Sigmar? Will they, or have they already pushed the story into a dead-end corner? Would they ever just end the story entirely and say, right, we've got to the end, this is the finish? I don't think so. I think more than ever now that will just never happen. Far from writing itself into a corner or a dead end, 40k has so much leeway and breathing room to flesh out other details, to adapt and rewrite things that were only vaguely mentioned in the past, or bring back things that were once mentioned and then never again. 40k has a huge wealth of untouched material. And it's true that Games Workshop are making big steps forward, more than they have done in decades, but I severely doubt they're going to wrap it all up in a couple of years. So I think whenever you see anybody scaremongering about this will be the end of 40k, like I did recently, you should ignore it completely. So I hope you've enjoyed this dive into the past of 40k. If you want to see more or a follow-up to this video, as per usual, hit the like and then tell me your thoughts down in the comments below. If you want me to come up with some random homebrew data cards or whatever for some curious things to mix into your games, tell me in the comments below as well. Maybe I'll have a bash of that. Thanks to all your support guys, as per usual. I'll see you in the next 10 Things episode.